Radical moderation. Sounds like an oxymoron, but it's actually a way we can save our world and our workplaces from whatever the hell it is we're all going through right now. We're in a low trust, high volatility time, and it affects everything, from the most horrific news headlines to the way we relate to the person in the desk across from us. Our armor is up, which isn't exactly conducive to conversation or collaboration. Lauren Hall is an author, speaker, professor, university administrator, and the coiner of the term radical moderation. We talked on this week's podcast about how embracing this mindset can help us connect more deeply with everyone in our lives. It starts with avoiding binary thinking. Life is lived in the gray, no matter what your social media algorithm tries to tell you. From there, we need to understand issues in their full complexity. To do that, we need to be curious and humble, especially when we're confronted with ideas we don't like. Lauren gives one of the most incredible examples of someone who chose to embrace those ideals, Daryl Davis, a black man who has spoken with dozens of KKK members and influenced many to renounce their white supremacist views. His story is remarkable. I don't expect most of us to live up to the model of someone like Daryl, but man, wouldn't the world be a better place if we tried? Welcome to the DesuckifyWork podcast, the show where we cut through the BS and find ways to make work more fun, more human, and less ridiculous. All of which makes your business more profitable, by the way. Today's episode is a part of the ProHuman Series in partnership with the ProHuman Foundation, where Lauren is an advisor. If you enjoyed this one, please like, share, rate, review, or subscribe to the podcast. Let the desuckifying begin. Here's Lauren. Okay, Lauren Hall, welcome to the DesuckifyWork podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I think we'll get into some interesting stuff today. I connected to you through the ProHuman Foundation, and I've been interviewing a few other folks from that group. So I think that will be interesting to bring that perspective into the conversation, particularly how that maybe relates to the world of work. But I know you deal a lot with the world of politics and social interactions and how we relate to each other and all that stuff. I think that'll be really interesting as well. So before we dive in, I'll just give you a chance to explain a little bit about what do you do for work and how you came to be doing it.
Yeah. Well, I'm an academic first and foremost. So I'm a professor of political science. I'm a political theorist by training. So I typically deal with the more theoretical side of things, but I'm really interested in sort of really broad questions about sort of how humans live together in communities. And obviously sort of social living is, I think we often have this kind of, there's sort of a binary or like a sort of stark dichotomy that people tend to see. There's either the sort of like utopian, like people think about communities as being these like beautiful places where people come together to do wonderful things, right? Which is, I hope that happens a fair amount of the time. But then other times, right, you have this sort of dystopian view of human communities, right? Full of conflict, full of, anger, worst case scenario, full of violence. So what I like to do is explore actually the messy middle, which is where most of us live, right? Most of us live in communities that are neither utopian nor dystopian, right? We live in sort of complex social landscapes. So I try to investigate that kind of space. My academic work is actually sort of focused on right now, sort of regulatory stuff. So it's a little, we probably don't need to dive into that. But my public writing, I write at the Radical Moderate's Guide to Life on Substack. And I have a podcast with my co-host, Laura Forcom, who's the president of the Independent Center. And that podcast is We Made This Political. And that podcast also looks at sort of some of these questions of sort of social living and how we live together as social creatures. And of course, the workplace is a big part of how we live together. So there's an obvious connection there. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I love the term radical moderate. So we'll come back to that to explain what that means, because it obviously sounds a little like, how could that be? You mentioned the work thing and the workplace as a big social living place, and it really is, and it's really artificial at times. I think it can feel like, whether it's sort of legacy rules that have just lived on for 100 years since industrial times or whatever. But it just feels, I had a guest, another guest from ProHuman, Rob Feld, who was on a couple weeks ago, and he said they're just not human places like often. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to kind of get your perspective on how do you see workplaces and what are some of the things that we're probably not recognizing about human behavior as we create our workplaces?
Well, so the other thing I actually should have mentioned is that my sort of day job right now is I'm an academic administrator. So I'm an associate
Okay.
dean, which means that I
Oh,
work really closely with people from all over the university, but I get to see sort of it's actually kind of a fun job because I get to see all the different levels and sort of how they interact with each other. But I also get to see all of the different levels of dysfunction, its own sort of thing. I think one of the things that I think there's a couple things that I learned moving from, and again, your listeners may not be familiar with sort of academia as its own special kind of place, but
yeah.
there are a lot of similarities, I think, in terms of how the overall kind of structure works.
Mm-hmm.
We are a lot of academic spaces are like deeply bureaucratic. And so there's systems in place that are not really, I think to your point, like they're legacy systems, like they're rules and policies that have been in place for decades. Like nobody
Mm-hmm.
has, like, there's no incentive for people to update these things until there's a lawsuit or something
Yeah.
bad happens, right? That's when people decide to update their policies.
Yeah.
And so I think, one of my goals as an associate dean, I'm like the quintessential, like, middle woman. Like I'm in between, like I'm right in the middle, right in between sort of chairs and faculty on the one hand, and then deans and provosts and presidents on the other. But one of the things I really try to do is just reduce friction points. Like if I can help people navigate the bureaucracy, if I can help make their lives a little easier, if I can facilitate their workflow, I see that as a huge part of my job. And we've been able to build really cool things together because it's almost like an intellectual game at this point where I just like, all right, here's the bureaucracy. We're going to get through it, right? It's like whitewater rafting, right?
Okay.
And I think you have to have a kind of sense of humor about it. You've got to be able to like say like, look, there's hoops that we have to jump through. We're going to do it. But to me, that's really important because I think, faculty have a lot of demands on their time. They have a lot of things that they're trying to do. And it's really easy for people to just hit bureaucratic walls and give up. And I think that leads to a lot of frustration. I think it's one of the main things that leads to like alienation with the workplace.
Yeah.
Like people feel as though they're being stymied, not because like, I think people understand resource constraints. I think they understand like, this is against the law. Okay, fine. Right. But if it's just like so difficult to do that it's actively painful, like eventually people are just not going to do that thing. And so I think that to me is one of the like best examples of how workplaces fail is when they fail to see how it's not a matter of resource constraints. It's not a matter of like, this is outside of our mission or this is actively illegal. It's just that you've put so much friction in the gears that people don't want to, like, it's not worth it for people to think creatively. It's not worth it for people to think in any kind of like exciting way. And so you really do, you destroy curiosity, you destroy excitement. I'm in a university. We should be deeply excited about coming to work and being in this intellectual space and thinking about ideas. And yet most of us are not, because you get caught in those the bureaucratic systems. And so I think about that a lot just because my role is really uniquely kind of in that middle space of being able to see how people are getting caught in these webs.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you're describing the academic world, but it's pretty parallel to my own experiences. I worked in advertising for years in agencies, and I worked with, large corporations. And there is a lot of that gunk, the friction that it's just the stuff that has you sort of banging your head against the wall. And you're just like, why? Just why? Right. And to your point, it shuts you down, or it creates like, to use the term politically differently, it creates these interesting political back channels, workarounds. People kind of go, okay, if I can't work in the quote unquote normal way, I'm going to find a way to get things done. And I'm not going to care as much about trampling over people or stabbing people in the back or whatever, because your rules apparently are, dysfunctional already. So I'm going to make them. And then you have all that to deal with on
Yeah.
top of the
Yeah.
friction and the gunk. And what do you see, if anything, that opens the door to fixing that even a little bit?
Well, I think the first piece of it is recognizing the effects that it has. It's funny, I actually did not think my academic work was going to become relevant in this conversation, but it's actually deeply relevant. Some of the work that I do looks at the sort of downstream effects of regulations.
Mm.
And I was looking, the primary area I was working in was healthcare and looking at, entrepreneurial people who are trying to do, cool new things in the healthcare space. I was primarily looking at birth and death, so maternity care and end of life care. And I'm in New York State, right? Heavily regulated state.
Yeah.
We regulate healthcare a lot. And I think people didn't realize how, and I think a lot of times regulators don't realize because they're not on the ground, right? And so a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the work that I do is trying to show people what life is actually like on the ground if you're trying to navigate this space, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of my work was looking at, for example, people who are trying to start a birth center in New York State. New York State has, depending on how you count, like 2 to 3 birth centers in the entire state.
Wow.
These are inexpensive outpatient facilities. There's no, like, they don't do surgery. There's no reason that we can't have more of them.
Yeah.
Most other states have more of them. But it's because we have this really circuitous, bureaucratic, and very, very expensive bureaucratic process. And so if you
Mm.
are a midwife or a doula trying to start a birth center, you're looking at like a couple $100,000 in regulatory costs before you even rent the clinic space, before you
Mhm.
even buy equipment, before you even hire staff. And so I think, the reason that happens, of course, is that we stack regulations, and this is true in the workspace too, right?
Mhm.
We stack policies because something goes wrong, and so we add a policy. But what we never really do, or we don't do very often, is we never zoom back out and say, okay, what is the user experience of
Mhm.
trying to navigate all these policies? Like, what does this do? And there's actually some wonderful people. Jennifer Pelka is she's a government reform advocate, a policy reform advocate. But one of her arguments is that we really need to, it's not about zero regulations. That's not the goal. But it's about zooming back out and thinking, like, especially in the workplace, what does this do to your like, what is a day in the life like for your employee?
Mm.
And I don't think HR often does that very often.
No, I don't think so.
And
Yeah.
state regulators don't do that. They don't look back and say, all right, I'm going to walk in the shoes of the person who's applying for this permit. And I'm going
Mhm.
to try to see how it feels.
Yeah.
And there's actually been some folks who have been talking about this in terms of like government welfare benefits, like walk through what it's like to try to buy groceries with, certain types of government assistance,
Mm.
like how frictionful is that process, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we don't, we spend a lot of time, and I think a lot of managers and CEOs and provosts, these higher level folks spend a lot of time up here,
Mhm.
and they don't spend a lot of time asking people on the ground, like, hey, what have you stubbed your toe on 15 times this week?
Yeah.
And like, is it necessary for you to stub your toe 15 times, like while trying to do this thing?
Yeah.
And so state regulators don't do it, HR doesn't do it, like, and so it's kind of endemic because it's just the way that large organizations operate.
Yeah.
But it's a real puzzle when it comes to, I think, the workplace broadly, but in
Mhm.
terms of academia and in terms of government, we need more people to do these kinds of sort of exploratory like checkpoints. And so if I were like sort of, well, I actually I won't forecast you. I'll add that at the end, but I have lots of ideas for reform, but I
Yeah.
think, getting onto the ground and actually experiencing what people experience when they're actually trying to do their jobs
Mhm.
in your workspace is really important. And I don't think a lot of managers, I think a lot of times they're just not even aware that it's a problem
Yeah.
until something really bad happens. And then they're like, oh, nobody told me. Yeah.
Yeah. Really interesting. Just the viewpoint of it as thinking about it as the user experience, right? And I think that's really valuable across any kind of business organization, whatever. Like, what's it like to live with the consequences of whatever we've set up here? And I think, you see a little more of a push in companies to start doing things like customer experience, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
helpful. I think the tech world probably pushed that in a little more because tech has such a focus on reducing friction, or at least I think it did in its early days. It's probably less now. But thinking about your sort of internal stakeholders through the lens of user experience, like as an employee at a company, at a school, what is it like? Like you said, like, why am I stubbing my toe on this thing 15 times? And is it necessary? Like, if it's necessary, then it can be like, okay, I know that part of my job includes getting my toe stubbed a bunch of times a day. At least I can connect the dots to why
Yeah.
it's there.
Yeah.
But probably a lot of it's not necessary. And
Yeah.
you mentioned the idea that like CEOs or the provosts, like they're not in it, right? And so they don't see it. And it brings up an interesting thought. I mean, you're in this kind of interesting role where you're seeing both directions, and the value of folks in those kinds of roles. I mean, I think from my own experience, I spent a fair amount of time in those roles, kind of in the middle management space. I got myself into more executive roles at times, but I always found myself when I was in those roles a little bit like, I still remember what people talk about, and we need to think about that. Whereas folks who maybe were up there for a longer time were like, what? What are you even saying? And it can be hard to sort of like walk the floor, so to speak. And even that, it's part of it is to ask people, but I think also really relying on the folks who are in those hinge points within an organization to be your voice. I see it. I'm actually living some of it. I feel some of their frustration, and therefore I can articulate how we might go about fixing it, and then we can work together. But I don't know that that happens as often as it could, or
No, and I think a lot of organizations underutilize middle managers. And I think the joke about sort of middle management is like it's like a classic cliche, right? And I think a lot of organizations use middle managers as just like sort of you push policy down onto them, and they push policy and processes down on everyone else, which is really the worst possible like way to use people like me. What you actually want to use them for is exactly what you want to use them as, a kind of part of a discovery process, right? Like, hey, what was the feedback from these teams about how this actually worked in practice? Like, what are you hearing on the ground as people think about, like I have to put out a big scheduling memo for our college every year. So I think a lot about what that looks like. And over the years, it's now like we joke, it's like 10 pages long. So we have to figure out some way to like get the scheduling memo sort of under control. But part of it is trying to, give people information, but also trying to figure out what are the major errors that people are falling into, but also what's the stuff that they just keep like stubbing their toe on over and over. So, but I think I think again, if you just look at the sort of flow of information and policies and processes completely top bottom. And I'm a bottom up person just by sort of philosophy and by just personality. And that's what I think you need to empower middle managers to do is give you the opportunity and the ability to pull information up from the average person and see how they're sort of experiencing the space. And if you do look at middle managers simply from the top down perspective, I think you lose your best people that way, because nobody likes being the like consistent bad guy. Like I'm happy to be the bad guy when I need to be, but if I'm just the consistent bearer of bad news, if I'm just the messenger that gets shot every single time, I'm going to get out as soon as I can and go do something else, right? Whereas those are the people I think you want to empower, because they can do really cool things if you let them. But I don't think we often let them.
I don't think we do either. And it's interesting. Like, I work as an executive coach, and I work with folks at executive level, but also sometimes in that middle manager level. And you really feel what you're talking about from some of those folks. It's just like, it's really hard to just pass along policy, particularly when it's not even articulated that well, sort of respecting that middle layer of management enough to say, like, here's why, or maybe at some point, hey, what do you think about this policy direction, and how might we refine it so that it, even at the very least, like just goes over better with the team, maybe, and then obviously you go deeper, and it's like not just goes over better, but actually supports them and then supports us as a result of supporting them. But that doesn't happen a lot. And when you're on the receiving end of that middle manager, you can see the sort of like life out of their eyes because they're
Hmm.
going like, you need to do this thing. And it's like, you know their heart's not in it, but you also
Yeah.
know, like they're sort of stuck. And
Yeah.
yeah. So what do you think would shift, what would help an organization, whether it's a school, a company, a nonprofit, whatever, what might help them shift and start to see the value of that layer and start to sort of have the flow be full directions as opposed to
Hmm.
just one direction?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple, and some of these I haven't actually participated in person, so I don't know
Yeah.
like how they actually work on the ground. But
Yeah.
one thing I think is really helpful is the growing interest in 360
Yeah.
reviews.
Yeah.
So getting information not just about someone's performance from the people above them, because
Hmm.
that looks a lot different than what happens when they're interacting with staff or they're interacting with, folks, their supervisees. And so getting feedback from people all around the person.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that could be really helpful. And again, the other thing too is that I think sometimes we use reviews like that as sort of a bludgeon. Like we a lot of times use
Hmm.
a lot of tools once we've identified a problem. What I think would be much more helpful is if we use a lot of these tools when just everything is just going the way it normally
Yeah.
goes. And
Yeah.
then you could talk to someone like me and say, hey, I want to hear from you how you think, the dean is doing or how you think the provost is doing. Like what are
Right.
areas that you think that we're consistently underperforming in? We have a new president coming in. He just started in July. And being a president of a large university is like a huge, I mean,
Yeah.
there's first of all like existential challenges coming from every single direction, but
Hmm.
then you also have to
Yeah.
learn this entire culture and there's all
Hmm.
there's all these things. But I think asking questions, I think so far he's doing a really good job. He's asking questions, he's being really curious about sort of how people are experiencing things. But I do think some tools like those 360 reviews can be really helpful. Getting again, like I think we already mentioned this, but like getting into the space in a more like having just frequent touch points,
Hmm.
frequent meetings where it's not because something's gone wrong. It's just there's a frequent like
Yeah.
we're just going to meet, we're going to have coffee, we're going to talk about how things are going, right? This
Yeah.
isn't like the only time I ever see you is when there's a crisis, right? That's not
Hmm.
how you create relationships with people. And it's also not how you get people to tell you the truth. I think you like if you
Yeah.
want people to be honest with you, you can't just show up when things are like going bad.
I'm defensive in that
Mm-hmm.
scenario. Hmm. One of the things that came up as you were just saying what you were saying is like, I find it really surprising sometimes when I talk with a lot of my clients and they have one-on-ones with either their team or their boss or both, just how tactical those meetings end up being. They're basically like status readouts
Yeah.
versus what you were just describing, which is like just talk to people, like what's going on, where are you stubbing your toe, what can I be doing that might
Mm-hmm.
support you better? Who are you struggling with? Like, are there any relationships that you're struggling with that I might be able to support? Like, and it's like that comes back to this idea of how workplaces can feel not human because we then just become like avatars for activity. We're
Mm-hmm.
just like, you do the thing and I do the thing, and then that person does the thing, and we just talk about doing things. And we very rarely talk about like, what is it actually like to come back to like, what is it like to be human in this space? And, you know, that sort of begs the question to me, I guess, maybe just to open this up a little bit more. Like when you're part of the ProHuman Foundation and we like that term evokes a lot of things to me. What does it mean to you to be pro-human?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of what I think about goes back to Daryl Davis, like as a human being, right? He
Yeah.
was one of the founders of the ProHuman Foundation.
Hmm.
I'm assuming your listeners are familiar with him, but I think one of the sort of virtues that he exemplifies is this virtue of curiosity, right?
Yeah.
He was confronted, he's a black man confronted by KKK members. And he didn't do what most of us would have done in that situation, which is say, I know exactly what these guys are about. And you could have done that. Like, and
Yeah. Of
actually,
course.
like a reason that might have been the rational thing to do,
Yeah.
right? And instead, he was really curious, right? He asked questions. He tried to figure out what was going on, and as a result, he did a lot of relationship building, right? And he actually ended up turning some like over 200 of these guys away from racial extremism. I think he's obviously he's a very, very special human being. But when I think about what it means to be pure human, and I'll admit that when I was a faculty member, I thought I knew exactly what people in administration were like, right? There was definitely this like us versus them kind of dynamic. The tribalism was very much there. And I walked into a lot of meetings thinking I knew exactly what the other person was thinking and exactly what they were doing. And that was in one of the real eye-opening, it was within the first 6 months of being in this job. I was like, it turns out that every situation is a lot more complex than I realize. The people that I'm working with are more complex than I realize. Like, it's very rare that any of my colleagues are like purely good or purely evil, right? They're all just like complicated people trying to do work in a complicated environment. And, some of them handle complexity better than others. But so one of the things I've been trying to do is just be really curious. And so when I think about sort of the pro-human, there's a lot of things I love about the pro-human mindset. Having a growth mindset in the workplace is so important, right? Those, but I think the first step is really curiosity. And as part of that curiosity is humility, right? Recognizing that you don't know what the other person is going through. You don't know what they're thinking. And that sets you up for, and again, as a manager and as like a leader, being able to ask your team, like, hey, what's working well this week? What's not working well this week? Like, just those kinds of questions can be really powerful, as opposed to your point, like if you walk into every one-on-one with like a really rigid agenda, you actually never get the like a lot of the issues that you need to know about come out through spontaneous conversation. So yeah, I think, curiosity is probably that number one thing from my perspective.
I can see that. I think curiosity has the effect of both opening our eyes, but it also sort of shuts down some of the judgment mechanisms that are very much like hair trigger for us. It gives us a way of at least shushing, quiet for a bit. I know you're going to come, but like, give me a moment. And then this idea of humility struck me as interesting too, because I think it's a wonderful value. And then I think in the context of just our world, and I think of how devalued it feels. The whole world of social media and the world of politics by extension, and, all of the noise in our system right now is the opposite of humility, right? It is, we are rewarding, sort of absurd levels of, self-aggrandizement. Like, it's just bigger is better, like bolder is better. Doing it all is the way to, sort of put your stamp on the world, put your stamp on communication, versus having nuance, recognizing complexity. How are you seeing that? And then I feel like some of the work that you're doing with your writing in the world of, radical moderation is trying to find a way through that. So how are you finding your way through so far?
Yeah, well, it's that's going to be a slow process, right? We're, politically, we're living in a deeply polarized time. Polarization is at an all-time high. But in particular, political scientists are worried about what we call affective or toxic polarization. And affective polarization is the difference between sort of regular polarization is me saying, like TJ has these really very different views than I do, right? We're polarized, but that doesn't mean that we can't connect across those differences. Whereas affective polarization is me saying, TJ has really different views from me, and as a result is a bad person. Like, I actually fear TJ because of the beliefs that he has. So affective polarization is really, really bad, because it means that you actually trigger the fear part of your brain, right? It shuts down the prefrontal cortex. It shuts down curiosity. If you think that the other side is a quintessentially bad person, like it's just, you think that their beliefs are dangerous. And we saw this actually in the last election, right? Both sides argued that the other side was an existential threat to democracy, right? And so if you think that someone is an existential threat to democracy, that completely changes whether you're going to be able to talk to them about legislation, whether you're going to be able to come to some kind of not even compromise, but just a decent solution to a human problem that doesn't happen to be a partisan problem, right? And it turns out that most of the problems that we're facing right now, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's immigration, whether it's, just name the issue that you want to talk about, healthcare. The best solutions that we know about are not partisan solutions. They're not owned by one party or the other. They're actually going to be kind of complex. They're going to require people from both sides coming together, but they're also not unprincipled solutions. And so this is why I use the term radical moderation, because I want people to stop thinking about moderation as though it's just compromise. So a lot of people think about moderation as just, well, here's this bad sort of extreme over here, and then here's another bad extreme, and we're just going to stick ourselves right in the middle. But an arbitrary middle point between two bad positions isn't a good place to be necessarily either, right? It's like you could be in just as bad of a place. Whereas I use instead, like, let's get rid of this black and white binary, and let's talk about life in all four dimensions. So let's escape from this sort of polar, this line that we see where we have, Democrats versus Republicans, right? Red versus blue, black versus white, Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter, right? Like we create all of these binary choices when it comes to policy issues. Yeah. But then when we actually look at like what people need in the real world, they need four-dimensional kinds of solutions. They need people to actually understand the full breadth and length and depth of the landscape that they're in. So I use this term landscape, and it actually applies to work really well too, because it goes back to what you and I were talking about before in terms of the ability to sort of get down onto the level that everyone else is traveling and figure out, like, have I strewn this pathway like with landmines, or is it a space that my employees can actually walk comfortably and do what they need to do? So in the political sphere, I talk a lot about sort of four-dimensional thinking. And a big part of that process is really recognizing that almost always policy issues are more complex than any partisan explanation will give them credit for. They're more complex than any simple partisan solution is going to be able to address. And as a result, we need to approach policy in general with a deep humility and with curiosity about, let's actually dig in. Let's see what the actual problems are. And I talk a lot about the fourth dimension in my work, which is time. And one of the things that I think we don't pay enough attention to, and this is, I think, goes back to one of the first comments you made when it comes to workplaces, but time has this really interesting effect on human social organizations. And so there's kind of emergent, like, sort of norms and values and rules and policies sort of emerge over time. And we don't often have like discrete points where we come back and say, wait a second, like, why is that still the case, right? Yeah. And so, when we're looking at sort of the policy landscape too, and just thinking about like historically why policy in the US looks so different than it does in Europe, we have to take into account the historical context, but then also, where we want to be in 5 years and 10 years. So for me, I think that, when I talk to my students about these kinds of questions, political questions, I think we've just done such a poor job of reducing really complex, hard policy problems to this simple right versus left binary. Yeah. And that leaves almost everybody. Independent voters are now 43% of the voting population because people are so tired of it, right? The partisan divide has not really helped us solve much. And so I think people are seeing that we're in this space where we need something different.
Yeah, I think everybody feels that. I think even folks who are probably reasonably dug in on one side or the other, there's probably some folks who are kind of far enough over the edge that they're probably pretty far gone. But there's a lot of folks who are dug in and who you can see trying to battle it out through that polarized lens, who I think would welcome a way of looking at it differently, just because at some point you can keep punching somebody, but at some point, like, if your arm gets tired and they're not moving, like, what am I doing? Right. And I think there's the tension that I noticed in what you're talking about, which is, it seems like, as you described, I'm like, well, of course, these are complicated problems. Our healthcare system, our immigration system, things like climate, things like whatever, ridiculously complicated. And then we have a sort of communication system that has become more and more drilled down to the soundbite and the
Yeah.
headline, and I think the media landscape has really aligned itself around that, so that you have sort of your red news and your blue news, right? And so it's
Hmm.
natural that they're gonna sort of continue, like it's incentivized to
Hmm.
stay on that polarized view of things versus looking out. So how do you see a way forward where, knowing some of these realities, what might start to open things up enough where people might look around and go, okay, I have a little hope now that we can do things.
Yeah. Well, so in my work on regulation, I think a lot about sort of edge disruptors, right? The people
Mm.
who can sort of operate for a variety of reasons kind of outside the regulatory sphere. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of examples of people who do that, not
Yeah,
like in a like a black market kind of way, but just like
right.
they're sort of they operate right on the edge and they're able to sort of disrupt things in a kind of gradual way.
Okay.
And I think we're actually seeing that in the media landscape. So your podcast is a really good example of this. My podcast with Laura, we're self-funded right now, and
Hmm.
we started a podcast,
Yeah.
right? And we're available on all podcast platforms. And same thing with Substack. That's a zero
Mhm.
entry cost. And so, if your message appeals to people, people subscribe. If it doesn't appeal, it doesn't. And I'm not saying that that is like a magic bullet, right? Because you still have to fight against the algorithm, and the algorithm still rewards outrage. But
Hmm.
I think there's so many people now who are really looking for spaces to connect across divides. I mean, I can't tell you how many, well, you probably heard this yourself, like how many people have, messaged me and said, like, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It actually gives me hope. Whereas reading
Hmm.
the regular news is just
Yeah.
like, I mean, we call it doom scrolling for a reason
Yeah.
because people
Yeah.
are not, they feel a deep sort of existential dread.
Hmm.
So I think that's really helpful and hopeful. And then, we actually just had Daniel Yudkin from More in Common on we made this political podcast a couple of weeks ago. Actually, the episode I think dropped this week, but he he has done a lot of work looking at, and More in Common broadly has done a lot of work sort of researching what most Americans agree on. And it turns out that the sort of red news, blue news, I mean, all of these are artifacts. They're artificial. It's just made up, right?
Yeah.
The average American, I mean, even on something like, when you look at something like abortion, people are
Yeah.
pro-life or pro-choice. Well,
Hmm.
they're only pro-life or pro-choice when you ask it in that very, very black and white way. The
Yeah.
average American actually has pretty similar views on like when abortion should be widely available and when it should be restricted. And most Americans actually have relatively moderate views on abortion. You would not
Hmm.
know that to
Yeah.
talk to like the various parties, because they have an incentive to keep
Hmm.
people polarized. So the work of organizations like More in Common, Builders, the ProHuman Foundation, I think we're
Hmm.
actually growing this really powerful coalition of organizations that are excited and willing to work across partisan lines, to work across ideological lines in order to animate that, what More in Common calls the exhausted majority, right? So
Hmm.
there's this majority that's just like, oh my gosh.
Hmm.
And we can actually give them hope, right? These are all like the middle managers of the world now
Yeah.
that I mentioned that, right?
Yeah.
They're the people who are just like they've been getting lots of bad news and having to give lots of bad news. But we can actually give them a sense of agency and a sense of, and also by just showing them like what actually you have so much more in common with your neighbor who voted for Trump or Harris or whoever your neighbor voted for, right? You have so much
Hmm.
more in common with this person than you think. And when we remove all of the other really wonderful things that you have in common and it just becomes like which yard sign you have in your yard,
Yeah.
then you actually do really lose the capacity for community. So I'm really hopeful that we have all these like edge disruptors in the media space. I'm really
Hmm.
hopeful that we have a growing coalition of people who are excited and energized. And I think in a lot of ways, like sometimes you do have to hit a crisis point
Yeah.
before people come together and realize we need to make some changes. But maybe this is just selection bias because I hang out in that space all the time. Like I'm
Yeah.
hanging out with, the ProHuman Foundation folks
Mm.
and the builders and all of those folks. But I do feel like we're actually at a sort of critical turning point where
Yeah.
what I'm calling radical moderation, what other people call certain kinds of centrism, or what other people call
Hmm.
building, like whatever you want to call it, I think there's a real excitement and energy about trying to rebuild connections to each other.
Yeah, I think there is, and I spend a lot of time in that space too. I also have a lot of exposure to the more extremes through various reasons, and that can
Hmm.
sometimes deplete your stores. It makes me think about, politics in work, which is another interesting topic. And there's
Mm,
kind of an apex moment, probably 2020, when central in work, right? I mean, I
mm,
think the election coming, some of the social disruption that happened,
yeah,
COVID, like it just was suddenly like you could not have politics in work almost. And then you
yeah,
started to notice certain companies raising their hand going, no, we have to get rid of it.
yeah.
I'm curious from your perspective, should politics be in the workplace?
A firm answer, no. As a political scientist, it's funny to sometimes hear me say this, but I
Yeah.
think we need to keep politics really firmly within its sphere. A lot of times we sort of create this false binary between like government and markets, but there's this huge, powerful middle called civil society that people
Mm,
forget about.
yeah.
And from the political theory perspective, you have people like Tocqueville and Montesquieu and all these other thinkers who really focused on what does it mean to have a functioning and strong civil society. And
Mhm.
it turns out that having a really strong civil society is it's the best uh, sort of protection you have against authoritarianism. It's the best protection you have against political extremes across the board. But the best way to destroy civil society is to politicize it, right?
Mm,
Because politics is by its nature, at least in the United States and actually most other places too, it's black and white, right? In the US, it's winner take all. And so by definition, it animates those tribal tendencies, right? It animates
mhm.
that us versus them. And it says to us, it puts us into a zero sum game with the people around us.
Yeah.
And when you're in a workplace, that's not what you want, right? In a
Yeah.
workplace, you want everyone to be in a non-zero sum game, right? If the
Mhm.
workplace is doing well, we're all doing well, right? If we are hitting our targets, if we're educating our students well, if you're an academic space, if we're serving our consumers well, if you're a corporate space, whatever. But you want people focused on the mission. So
Mhm.
unless your workspace is explicitly political, like a
Yeah.
campaign to elect someone, okay,
Right.
fine, that's where politics belongs.
Yeah.
But unless it's that kind of workplace, there's absolutely no reason to let politics in. And in fact, it's actively bad for your space because it destroys the commonalities that people otherwise would have with each other.
Really.
So I'm a big fan of what's called institutional neutrality, which is just be neutral about anything that does not immediately affect your mission
Yeah.
as as an organization. And a lot of people don't like it, but I think
Yeah.
it's really
I
powerful.
I like it. I have spent a lot of time in places where that's definitely not the case. I mean,
Yeah.
I worked in advertising, and advertising as an industry, probably, I mean, maybe not that different from academia, is fairly left leaning.
Hmm.
And so I think when you have an industry that is fairly whichever way leaning,
Yep.
it can get comfortable taking on sort of policy choices. And I think what you saw during sort of 2020 through 22, 3 was a lot of that,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
sort of just an expectation that everybody agrees with that. And like to some degree, there
Hmm.
was like 80, 90% truth to that. But if you were even in the middle, and
Yeah.
you weren't, I mean, like even not acknowledging the fact that there are certainly people who work in advertising or in academia who would actually be conservative, but to the
Yeah.
extent that there are people in the middle who just have like more nuanced views about some of these topics, whether it's the Black Lives versus Blue Lives or the like whatever, like you might be like, well, I can see some of this and I can see some of that. And I actually think there's
Hmm.
a different way we could talk about this, but you
Yeah.
can't because the
Yes.
organization has drawn a line in the sand. And then you marry that with some of the DEI efforts that I think were particularly happening during that time. I think were maybe as a result of the extreme pendulum swing the other way, people are exploring ways to maybe make that experience better and more truly inclusive. I think
Hmm.
what I
Hmm.
noticed was like, how can you have a inclusive environment or even a diverse environment if you're putting these really sharp stakes in the ground around pretty contentious issues, even if you believe that 80 to 90% of your people agree with them. So, and I think there's still some of that sitting there. I mean, here's an example that you mentioned, the abortion issue, which is obviously one of those more contentious ones. when
Hmm.
abortion was sent back to the states through the overturning of Roe v. Wade, a lot of companies and certainly a lot of ad agencies implemented a policy of reimbursing travel to states
Mm.
that are more friendly. And on like for a lot of folks, and I would put myself in this place, like that seems nice, but I
Hmm.
also realize some people might not think that's nice. Like if you're more firmly in the pro-life thing, you might be like, so wait, some of the money that I'm helping to bring into this company is doing that. And then
Hmm.
how do I show up and support the mission if it feels like part of your mission is actually opposed to me? So if you're in that space, what do you recommend people do if you find yourself in a space where you're not, there is some politics creeping in and you're not aligned? Is it just get out and find a place that's more suited to you, or is there change that you can maybe try to affect from within?
Well, I think usually you're not alone. So that's the first thing, right?
Yeah.
Find the other people. And if you can find people from a different political view who are also uncomfortable with it, that
Yeah.
really helps. Like
Hmm.
the last thing that you want is like the four conservatives in a firm like coming together and like pushing back against the, like 95% of, liberals or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you but there's usually, right, you can usually find actually a kind of diverse
Hmm.
group of people who just don't want either because not they may even not have like terribly strong principled positions on
Yeah.
something. They just may not want it in the workplace. Like it's
Yeah.
like a lot of people find politics deeply divisive and they just
Hmm.
don't want it in the space that they spend 8 hours a day. Like, and
Yeah.
that actually is a really commonsensical kind of approach.
Yeah.
So I think getting people to sort of think like, and I think sometimes these have to happen. There has to be some back channel conversation sometimes with leadership.
Hmm.
Like you may not be aware of this, but there's a small group of us who don't think that this was the right move. Here's our principled positions for why it's not.
Yeah.
Probably the worst thing that you can do is like engage in debates over Slack or something. Like don't bring that element into it, but
Yeah.
just try to be really thoughtful about here's the positions that we have. I mean, I think one of the things that another reason I think institutional neutrality is so important is that I think when we think about things in zero sum kinds of terms, and when we do this kind of polarization of even the workplace, the assumption is, and I actually hear people use this phrase, right? The assumption is that we are on the right side of history, whoever we are,
Yeah.
and then the other side is on the wrong side of history. So
Hmm.
eventually, because we take this sort of view, the implication is that like people on the wrong side of history will go away,
Yeah.
meaning that like eventually we will live in a homogenous
Hmm.
political landscape. Well, guess how often that has happened in the history of the human species?
Yeah.
Never. So the reality is like every workplace will be heterogeneous when it comes to politics, again, unless it's like a political campaign.
Yeah.
But it's much, much better to recognize that that pluralism exists and is
Hmm.
there than
Yeah.
it is to pretend that it will go away if
Hmm.
we enforce certain kinds of policies on it. And so I think it just goes back to the question in workplaces of, what kind of workplace do people get excited to show up for? Do they
Hmm.
get excited to show up for a workplace that has a shared mission where everyone understands what the goals are and what we're working for?
Yeah.
Or do they get excited to show up for a workplace that's divided, where people have to hide their political beliefs, where people engage in really awkward kinds of conversations over Slack about things that they
Hmm.
shouldn't be talking about?
Yeah.
And so, as a leader, I would say, hey, let's really think about carving out, being really clear
Hmm.
about what our mission is and what are the things that this team of people came together to do. Now,
Hmm.
again, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be conflicts. That,
Of
like
course.
it's the workplace, right?
Yeah.
But you can at least eliminate a guaranteed source of conflict if
Mhm.
you keep politics out.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And what I also wonder is if you're sort of fueling the tribal muscles, is it also extending to some of the natural tribalism that can just happen within an organization? Like
Yeah,
in
yeah.
advertising, there's the creative team and there's the client services team, and there's
Mm,
a natural tension there. If
yeah.
you sort of ramp up that muscle in everybody, that's only going to get worse when like we should be
Hmm.
trying to figure out how do we get these people to realize, everyone realize we're all chasing the same thing and we just want to like lean on people for their various skill sets and expertise. And I'm
Yeah.
sure it shows up similarly. You mentioned how you had your view as the
Hmm.
faculty of administration, and now you're on the other side and you're kind of like, oh, okay, I see it. Now I'm
Yeah.
seeing the full picture. So I worry that we end up stoking the fires of just kind of like
Mhm.
putting ourselves in that fight or flight mode all the time. And so I'm ready to
Yeah.
fight all the other departments or organizations. Mm.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, I want to like turn on the more optimistic switch as we've kind of maybe
Yeah.
missed some of the challenges. So, couple thoughts here. One, I want to ask you about waving a magic wand and making all this better. Before I do that, though, I'd actually love to give you a chance to just like, what would be a question that you could ask of people out there that might get them thinking about all this stuff we're talking about differently?
Well, I think, I go back to, maybe a really an oversimplistic one is, but it's something like, are you happy with the politics that we have now? Do
Mm,
you feel as though what's happening is serving our communities?
yeah,
Do you, like, as a voter, do you feel
yeah,
as though, going back to the citizen experience, do we feel as though the citizen experience is being prioritized by either party right
yeah,
now? And
mm,
I would say clearly the answer is no, but I
yeah.
would love to hear from other people, right? I think so.
I would
So
too.
that is a question that I think can help break people out of the us versus them tribalism.
Yeah,
Is instead to say, what serious problems are we not solving because we are so distracted by all of this
yeah.
spectacle?
I really like that question, and the thing that shows up for me is sort of the distinction between tolerance and acceptance or embrace. That, like, when you talk about a civil society, I think it's deeply rooted in a tolerance for all of the various points of view without necessarily asking for, I agree, or I fully embrace what you're about. I can accept that, okay, there you are, and
Yeah.
here I am, and now let's figure things out together.
Yep.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, coming back into the world of work, if you could wave that magic wand and make it fully desuckified and maybe fully pro-human,
Hmm.
what does that world look like?
Well, this wouldn't be a magic wand, but I think that, having sunset provisions or at least a review period for, most of the major policies that we
Mm,
have, just having, a group that could just periodically say, hey, is this still working? Right?
mm,
Does this still, right, get back to how people experience these rules and how people experience these processes. And if it doesn't work, ask for advice. Ask people. I mean, a lot of the people who have the information that you need as a leader to improve are the ones who are dealing daily with the outcomes of the processes that you put in place. And so
yeah,
ask them for advice, ask them for their thoughts. And I think actually, if you look at a lot of the like really transformative business leaders, right, they're the ones who actually got onto the factory floor and like asked
yeah.
people what's going on. So that's a really easy way to sort of make things at least marginally better, right?
Yeah, and I actually think it has the potential to be more than marginal because, like, we often lose sight of just how much our policies and procedures and process affects your customer experience. To come back to
Mm-hmm.
that term, it just has a really big effect. I want to have a little fun now. If you've listened to my podcast at all, you hear some sound effects at the beginning and end of the show. Mine is all about cats meowing and screaming and the occasional other absurd sound, but I always invite the guest to make a sound, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to be absurd or silly. It can just be anything. So, do you have a sound you want to add to our growing library?
Yeah, I think my sound will be the sound that I envision or that I hear sort of the exhausted majority making, which is sort of like part exhaustion, part disgust. Like that's the hopefully that
Yeah,
sound came
yeah.
out.
There's actually like a release though that comes with that.
Yes.
Then like, okay, get rid of it, and now maybe I can do something. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say this has been such a fun conversation, Lauren. And before we go, I want to give people a chance to learn more about what you're doing. So, how can people track you down online?
Yeah. So I have a website, laurenkehall.com. That's super easy. But
Hmm.
I'm also at the Radical Moderates Guide to Life. If you Google that, it
Okay.
should be the first and only Substack that comes up.
Okay.
And those are the easiest ways to find me. I'm
Okay.
also on LinkedIn, but try
Awesome.
those two first. Thank
Okay,
you.
cool. Well, I highly recommend the Substack. I started digging into it before this episode, and I really appreciate your perspective. I think we need more voices like yours that are bringing some nuance to a overly black and white world.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm glad podcasts like yours exist too. This is great.
Awesome. Thanks, Lauren. Well, take care.
Thanks, TJ. Bye.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the DesuckifyWork podcast. And a huge thanks to Lauren for bringing a refreshing and hopeful perspective to the show. You can follow Lauren on LinkedIn and check out her Substack, The Radical Moderate's Guide to Life. It's the perfect antidote to our clickbait-riddled feeds. If you enjoyed the conversation and would like to help your teams bring their absolute best to work, I invite you to schedule a free half-hour discovery session. Type meow in the calendar invite, and I'll also send you a free DesuckifyWork t-shirt. Bye, everyone!